Someone typed a question into an AI model that people have been asking in one form or another for over 2,000 years. Who actually built the pyramids? They expected a hedge, a polite, evasive non-answer, the kind you get when you ask a machine something it isn't sure about. Instead, it laid out an answer with a level of detail that stopped them cold. Not a theory, not a guess. Names, payroll records, the actual daily schedule of a work crew that hauled stone for the Great Pyramid, written down by one of the workers himself, on a scrap of papyrus that sat buried for 4,500 years before anyone ever read it. This is a story about that answer. And it's a story about how one of the most persistent myths in human history, the idea that we still don't actually know who built these things, or that we secretly can't explain it, finally runs into what the ground has been telling us all along. Let's start with why this question even feels mysterious in the first place. Because that mystery isn't coming from a lack of evidence, it's coming from a lack of attention. For most of the last 2 centuries, popular imagination filled the gap left by incomplete records with 2 competing stories. The first was slavery, the image of tens of thousands of chained laborers whipped forward by overseers, dying by the thousands to raise stone for a god king who cared nothing for their suffering. That image comes almost entirely from Greek historian Herodotus, writing around 450 BC, roughly 2,000 years after the pyramids were actually built, based on stories he was told by local guides who likely had their own reasons for dramatizing the past. Herodotus claimed the Great Pyramid took 20 years to build and required 100,000 men working in rotating shifts of 3 months each. A number modern archaeology has never been able to confirm, and based on the size of the actual workers' settlement at Giza, appears to be a significant exaggeration. He was a historian, but he was also, by his own admission, a collector of stories, writing centuries after the fact, in a culture that already viewed the pyramids as ancient and half-legendary. It's a compelling image. It shows up in movies, in textbooks, in casual conversation. And it is not what the archaeological record shows. The second story is even stranger and far more recent. It's the idea that the pyramids are simply too precise, too massive, too mathematically sophisticated to have been built by Bronze Age humans at all, and that the real explanation must involve some lost, more advanced civilization, or something not human at all. This idea gained real traction in the 20th century through a handful of popular books and television specials that leaned heavily on the pyramid's genuinely impressive precision. The fact that its base is level to within about 2 centimeters across more than 200 meters, and its sides are aligned to true north with an accuracy modern surveyors still find remarkable and use that precision to argue human beings of that era simply couldn't have managed it. It has no serious support among Egyptologists, historians, or archaeologists, but it spreads easily because it sounds more exciting than the truth, and because most people have simply never seen the evidence that actually answers the question. So let's look at what Grok, or any AI model doing this properly, is actually drawing on when it answers this question with real specificity. Because the evidence is not scarce. It's some of the best documented labor history from the ancient world, and most of it has only become public knowledge in the last 30 years. In 1990, archaeologists working near the Giza Plateau stumbled onto something nobody was specifically looking for. A tourist's horse had fallen into a hole in the sand, and when researchers investigated, they found the edge of an ancient wall. What followed, over the next 2 decades of excavation, led by archaeologist Mark Lenner and Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass, was the discovery of an entire lost city. Not a monument. A workers' town, sitting less than half a mile from the pyramids themselves, built to house, feed, and support the people who built them. This wasn't a scattering of huts. Archaeologists uncovered bakeries capable of producing thousands of loaves of bread a day. Breweries for beer, which functioned as a staple part of the ancient Egyptian diet and wage system. Not a luxury. Large communal halls where workers ate together, copper and stone tool workshops, and perhaps most tellingly, a cemetery, positioned close to the pyramids containing the bodies of the workers themselves. Here is where the slavery myth runs directly into the evidence and loses. Analysis of the skeletons found in that cemetery shows healed bone fractures, consistent with the kind of injuries you'd expect from hard, physical labor, evidence that workers who were hurt on the job were treated and allowed to recover rather than discarded. Their diet, based on isotopic analysis of the bones, included substantial amounts of meat, a marker of reasonably good nutrition for the era, not starvation rations. And their burial placement, close to the sacred pyramid complex itself, in a culture where burial location carried enormous religious significance, is not how a society treats slaves. It's an honor. It suggests these workers were seen, at least in death, as participants in something considered sacred, not disposable labor to be worked to death and forgotten. Then there's the evidence with names actually attached to it, and this is the part that tends to genuinely surprise people the first time they hear it. Graffiti, left behind by the work crews themselves, has been found on stone blocks and in chambers throughout the Giza pyramids, written in the same kind of casual, informal hand, you'd expect from workers marking their own handiwork rather than official royal inscriptions. One of the best-known crews called themselves Friends of Khufu, a nickname referencing the pharaoh the Great Pyramid was built for. Another called themselves Drunkards of Menkaure, referencing a later pyramid and most likely the beer rations that came with the job. These aren't the marks of anonymous, faceless slave labor. They're the marks of organized teams with their own identity, their own inside jokes, and enough pride in the work to sign it. And then there's the discovery that, more than any other single piece of evidence, answers the who built it question in the most literal way possible. In 2013, a team of French and Egyptian archaeologists led by Pierre Tallet was excavating a set of caves near the Red Sea coast. At a site called Wadi al-Jarf, when they found a collection of papyrus fragments dating to the reign of Khufu himself, the pharaoh the Great Pyramid was built for. Among them was a document that's come to be known as the Diary of Merer, the oldest inscribed papyrus ever discovered in Egypt, and one of the oldest written documents of any kind found anywhere in the world. Merer was a mid-level official, an overseer of a boat crew, and his diary is, almost unbelievably, a logbook. Day by day, over several months, he records his crew's actual work schedule. Trips down the Nile, hauling limestone blocks from quarries at Tura to the construction site at Giza, deliveries logged against overseers by name, rations distributed, bureaucratic complaints about supply shortages that would sound almost mundane in any modern workplace. It reads less like myth and more like a shipping manifest, because that's essentially what it is. It is a direct, contemporary first-hand account written by one of the men who physically helped move the stone of the actual logistics of building the Great Pyramid. This is the closest thing archaeology has to a signed confession, except there's no crime here at all. Just an extraordinary coordinated act of engineering, labor, and bureaucracy, all performed by ordinary Egyptian men doing a job for pay, food, beer, and burial rites, organized under the authority of the pharaoh's state. So when an AI model answers the question of who built the pyramids with real specificity, what it's actually doing is synthesizing this evidence, the workers' village, the cemetery, the graffiti, Merer's diary, clearly and quickly, in a way most people have simply never had laid out for them in one place. It isn't uncovering a hidden truth. It's reciting a settled one, just doing it more comprehensively and more accessibly than a textbook chapter most people skipped in school. The actual picture that emerges, once you put all of this together, looks like this. The pyramids were built primarily by a rotating labor force of Egyptian citizens, not permanent slaves, organized in shifts, likely as a form of tax obligation or state labor service known as corvée labor, a system where citizens owed the state a set amount of work each year in lieu of currency, since Egypt didn't operate on the kind of cash economy we'd recognize today. This wasn't unique to pyramid building either. The same basic labor obligation system was used for irrigation projects, canal digging, and other state infrastructure throughout ancient Egyptian history, which is part of why archaeologists recognize the pattern so clearly at Giza. Alongside this rotating labor force was a smaller number of permanent, highly skilled workers, stonemasons, engineers, and craftsmen who lived at Giza more or less full-time and passed their expertise down through the project's decades-long construction. Estimates for the total workforce during peak construction periods, based on the size of the workers' village and the logistics documented in records like Merer's diary, run in the range of 20 to 40,000 people, far fewer than the 100,000 slaves Herodotus claimed, and organized with a level of state bureaucracy, food supply logistics, and medical care that would be impressive for any era, let alone one 4,500 years ago. Compare that daily routine to what popular imagination usually pictures. Instead of chained figures being whipped up a ramp, the actual picture is closer to a functioning small city. Men rotating through fixed work terms, likely around 3 months at a stretch, sleeping in barracks-style housing, eating bread and drinking beer rationed out by state administrators, receiving medical attention when injured, and returning home afterward to their families and their farms, having fulfilled a labor obligation the same way a farmer might have fulfilled a tax payment. It was hard, physically demanding work, make no mistake. Moving multi-ton blocks of stone is grueling under any circumstances. But it was organized labor within a functioning economy, not the brutal, disposable slave system later writers imagined onto it. None of this required lost technology. None of it required outside help. What it required was exactly what the evidence shows: a centralized state with the organizational capacity to mobilize tens of thousands of workers, feed them, house them, pay them in rations, quarry and transport millions of tons of limestone and granite, and coordinate that effort over roughly 2 decades, using ramps, sledges, copper tools, and an extraordinary depth of surveying and engineering knowledge that Egyptian civilization had already been refining for centuries before Khufu's reign even began. It's worth addressing the precision argument directly, because it's the one piece of the "this seems impossible" case that actually has real numbers behind it, even if the conclusion people draw from those numbers doesn't hold up. The Great Pyramid's base is nearly a perfect square. its corners close to true right angles and its sides aligned to the cardinal directions with an accuracy of a fraction of a degree. That is genuinely impressive engineering. It is not, however, unexplained engineering. Egyptian surveyors had already been using tools like the Merkhet, a simple sighting instrument used alongside plumb lines to track stars and establish true north, for generations before Khufu's reign, and their understanding of basic geometry, including ratios later formalized in Greek mathematics, was already mature enough to lay out level, square foundations across huge distances using sight lines, water leveling in trenches, and careful, repeated measurement. Ramp systems, whether a single straight ramp, a switchback ramp wrapping the pyramid's sides, or some combination of both, remain debated among Egyptologists in their specific details, but not in their basic premise, since partially built ramps and construction debris have actually been found at other pyramid and monument sites, including a well-preserved example at the Hatnub Quarry documented by archaeologists in 2018. The disagreement in the field is about exactly which method was used at Giza specifically, not about whether Bronze Age ramps, sledges, and levers were physically capable of the job. They were, and we have physical ramps left behind at other sites to prove it. It's also worth stepping back from the Great Pyramid specifically, because it's easy to talk about Khufu's pyramid as if it were an isolated miracle, when it was actually the product of a tradition that had already been developing, and would keep developing, for generations. Khufu's father, Sneferu, is the pharaoh actually responsible for perfecting the true smooth-sided pyramid shape. After building at least 2 earlier pyramids that partially collapsed or had to be redesigned mid-construction, evidence, preserved in the structures themselves, of real trial and error, real engineering failures, and real course correction by human builders learning as they went. The bent pyramid at Dashur, one of Sneferu's projects, visibly changes its angle partway up, a physical record of engineers realizing their original design was structurally unsound and adjusting the plan before it was too late. That's not the signature of a civilization operating with mysterious, effortless, perfect knowledge. That's the signature of real engineers solving real problems, sometimes getting it wrong and getting better with each attempt. By the time Khufu's architects, most likely his vizier Hemunu, whose own tomb still stands near the pyramid complex today, began work on the Great Pyramid, they were drawing on decades of accumulated hard-won experience, not starting from nothing and not needing help from anywhere outside their own tradition. The Sphinx tells a similar story, long treated as an even deeper mystery than the pyramids themselves. Modern geological and archaeological analysis, including work by geologist Robert Schoch and Egyptologists who've studied the surrounding quarry, strongly indicates the Sphinx was carved from a single mass of limestone bedrock left over after stone was quarried from the area to help build the pyramid complex nearby, most likely during the reign of Khafra, Khufu's son. The unfinished, roughly hewn quarry walls surrounding the Sphinx enclosure line up with the tool marks and construction techniques used elsewhere on the Giza Plateau during that same period. It fits, both geologically and archaeologically, into the same continuous story of Old Kingdom Egyptian engineering, not a separate, unexplained anomaly requiring some entirely different origin. So why does the mystery persist? Why do so many people still feel, watching a video like this one, that the truth must be more exotic than skilled, well-organized human labor, even after seeing the evidence? Part of it is simple unfamiliarity. The workers' village wasn't discovered until 1990. The Diary of Merer wasn't found until 2013 and wasn't fully translated and published until years after that. Most people currently alive went through their entire education before either discovery became public knowledge, which means most of what people know about pyramid construction is inherited from Herodotus, from old movies, and from documentaries made before the evidence existed. The mystery isn't really a mystery. It's a knowledge gap between when the discoveries were made and when they actually reached most people's awareness. There's also something worth naming honestly about why the alternative explanations keep circulating even after being addressed by working archaeologists for decades. Alternative theories tend to travel faster and further than the evidence that debunks them, partly because they're simpler to package into a dramatic headline, and partly because there's a real, if uncomfortable, undercurrent in some of that content that quietly assumes ancient African and Middle Eastern civilizations couldn't have achieved this level of sophistication on their own, an assumption serious historians and archaeologists have pushed back on directly, since it isn't supported by a single piece of physical evidence and tends to say more about the person making the claim than about the ancient world. The actual archaeological record shows the opposite. A sophisticated, literate, mathematically capable state run by and for Egyptians that built these monuments using knowledge it had spent centuries developing on its own. And part of it, honestly, is that the truth, while genuinely remarkable, doesn't carry the same emotional charge as a secret. A well-organized ancient state fed, housed, and paid tens of thousands of skilled workers to build one of the most enduring structures in human history, and we have the workers' own diary to prove it, is an astonishing fact. It just doesn't hit the same nerve as we don't actually know how this was built, even though only one of those two statements is true. Here's the part worth sitting with. The real story is more impressive than the myth, not less. It means a Bronze Age civilization, working with copper tools, ramps, wooden sledges, and rope, organized a state bureaucracy sophisticated enough to track individual work crews by name, log daily shipments of stone down a river, ration food for tens of thousands of people, and treat injured workers well enough that their bones show healed fractures instead of signs of abuse. It means those workers were proud enough of their labor to leave their team names carved into the stone they moved. It means one of them, a boat overseer named Merer, kept a diary so ordinary and so detailed that 4,500 years later, we can read exactly what he did on exactly which days. That's not a mystery waiting to be solved by artificial intelligence, or by aliens, or by a lost civilization nobody's found. That's a mystery that's already been solved by archaeologists digging in the sand near Giza, and by a diary written by a man named Merer, doing his job. Never imagining that his daily complaints about a limestone shipment would end up being read by an entire world 4,500 years later. Who built the pyramids? Egyptians did. Organized, skilled, paid, fed, and in Merer's case, remembered by name. If stories like this, the ones where the real evidence turns out to be stranger and better than the myth, are what you're here for, subscribe, because there's a lot more buried out there than people realize.